Hello and welcome to the Auto Buyer's Guide podcast powered by Alex on Autos. I'm Tim Masso here with the man himself, Alex Dykes.
Hey everybody, and I guess we'll just go ahead and add this to the screen here. If you're not watching this on YouTube, go ahead and click on over there because behold, this is the Grand Highlander.
A grander Highlander. Alex,
Yes,
is it bigger?
it is the grandest of the Highlanders, and Toyota is really cagey on details, which I think is a pity because it is bigger than a regular Highlander, but we don't know exactly how much bigger. You can see the overhangs are definitely longer. Size-wise, this appears to be somewhere between, obviously, a Sequoia and a Telluride. It's probably somewhere in that range there. They're keeping some of the details for a little bit later. If you are watching this, then pay attention to the description of the video, or actually that on the podcast as well, because if there are any additional details after we film this, then we will fill you out there. But basically, it looks kind of like a RAV4, don't you think?
Steroidal, but yes.
Yeah, like a big RAV4.
What is the target here? Like, what vehicle pops to the mind of a Toyota product planner when he thinks about the natural, rival for a vehicle like this in the U.S. market? What are his targets? What are his benchmarks?
To be honest, this really does seem to be targeted at Telluride and Palisade almost directly. I think everybody in the industry, including Hyundai and Kia, were shocked by the relative success of Telluride and Palisade because they are so large on the inside. And a lot of customers want something that's just as efficient as a crossover, but has more minivan-like room inside, but doesn't look like a minivan. So I think this is filling that dual need there. The person that maybe is looking at a Sienna thinks that it's not rugged enough for them, doesn't have the kind of all-wheel drive system they want, maybe wants a bit more room, doesn't want to get all the way into a Sequoia. So less expensive than Sequoia, smaller on the outside than Sequoia, 7 or 8 passenger seating on the inside, and a usable third row.
Now, to me, the only way this makes sense is if the length is added after the front seats, but before the rear axle. Is there any indication that this is going to be a longer wheelbase vehicle?
Yes, it definitely appears to be a longer wheelbase version of the Highlander. When you look at like this picture here, the side of the Grand Highlander, it's definitely longer. It's definitely boxier as well, and it looks a little bit less like a Subaru. It looks more like a Toyota vehicle, I would say, generally speaking, which is definitely a good thing. I think it's an attractive look. Exactly how it's going to behave in the market space, we don't know yet. That obviously are no production targets, and it is going to be 4-cylinder only. So regular 2.4-liter turbo out of the regular Highlander, 2.5-liter non-turbocharged hybrid out of the regular Highlander, and the 2.4-liter turbocharged hybrid out of the Crown, producing a maximum of around 360 some odd horsepower is the quote there from Toyota. So it's going to be pretty peppy. Exactly how peppy, be sure and stay tuned because I will be driving this in mid-May. So stay tuned for that. That's coming up soon. And we'll get you all the details you need to know about whether you should cancel your order on that Telluride you can't find.
Or the Chevy Traverse that you can get at a great price?
Yeah, the Traverse is definitely big, but the third row of the Traverse definitely is smaller than this one. This one is much boxier and roomier in the third row. So I think that they're trying to give third row room that is really lacking in the Sequoia. And I think that's going to be the surprising part once we finally see specifications, is I would not be surprised if this third row is actually bigger and roomier than the third row that we find in the Sequoia. If you aren't already a subscriber of the YouTube channel, be sure and check that out because I will be crawling all over one after we film this video, but before the embargo lifts, so you can find even more up-to-date breaking news on that there.
And if you like power, remember, this generation of the Highlander, the standard Highlander, went to a 4-cylinder hybrid system that made combined about 243 horsepower. The Crown also uses a 4-cylinder, but it makes between 340 and 360 horsepower, which is a big step up to what we would have called almost V8 power a generation ago. So if you've got maybe not a need for speed, but a need for more speed, the Grand Highlander should step up in that regard.
Yeah, and I'm going to be intrigued to see how it drives because, in the Crown, the regular hybrid system is far better sorted than the hybrid max drivetrain. And if I were buying a Crown, that's what I would select in the Crown is the lower horsepower regular hybrid. It's considerably better fuel economy. It doesn't feel disconnected like the 6-speed system can. I am really shocked that Toyota went in that design direction with the hybrid max system. It is a 6-speed automatic, some pancake electric motors, some clutches in there, and then a fairly small electric motor in the back. So there's a lot of torque steer. It doesn't feel like the Volvo plug-in hybrid system, even though design-wise it's actually closer to what Volvo's doing than what Toyota's traditionally done.
Okay, and do we have any guidance on pricing?
Not a word yet, but soon. Expect it to be towards the upper end. There's obviously going to be some overlap with the regular Highlander. How much overlap, we don't know.
All right, so here's a quick question before we kick into our main topic. ChatGPT, or GPT, is all over the internet right now. ChatGPT, for those of you who have not seen this, is a sort of combination of two things that have existed for a long time: case-based logic and a search engine. And it does wonderful things if you wanted to simulate a human being. It's the closest thing I've ever seen that could pass a Turing test, which is indistinguishability from a human conversation.
Mm-hmm.
That said, if you look at ChatGPT and you look at autonomy right now, ChatGPT feels like the Terminator is almost here, whereas Tesla full self-driving doesn't know the difference between like a red and a green light. How can full self-driving,
Yeah.
after so many years and so many billions, be this far behind an AI created by a startup?
Because it's a much more difficult thing to do to drive a car. You need to not only just talk with someone, language skills, but you have to be able to interpret the world around you and make decisions about that world around you. It's considerably more difficult. I mean, just orders of magnitude more difficult. I have a serious doubt as to whether we will see any sort of user-end affordable self-driving thing in the way that people have been wanting Tesla full self-driving to be. At least for 10 years, if there's even customer demand for the price points that it would command. Full self-driving is bonkers crazy expensive. And it's a hands-on the wheel system, technically, according to Tesla and everything else that's out there. Yeah, you can sit back and do a hands-off thing, but even by what they're telling the government regulatory agencies and their court filings when they get sued over these things, they're saying, "Oh no, we're just kidding. It's not full self-driving." Telling people that all the hardware they needed on board is full self-driving enabled. We're just kidding on that one. That's a hope, an aspiration, not a marketing claim, and that's really, I think, probably the most disappointing thing to some of the Tesla fans out there is that now Tesla has publicly said in official court filings that full self-driving is aspirational, not a marketing claim. And they basically also said the engineer that they were interviewing, I guess, deposing for this whole lawsuit debacle, actually said that essentially the full self-driving demo video from 4 years ago? How old is that thing?
I think it was like 2016, but even so,
Yeah,
like
it was all fake.
Yeah, we were on the cusp. We thought we were on the cusp of robo taxis, and Elon Musk even said robo taxis are coming. That's our business model of the future. But for once, I'm not beating up on Tesla here because no one's anywhere near level 5. No one's anywhere near level 3 that's like marketable on the U.S. roads right now. Stuff like that's available overseas. I don't know how good it really is. Tesla full self-driving is still level 2, and significantly, it's only camera-based. But it's amazing to me that by some industry accounts, $100 billion have been vaporized on AI self-driving cars, and we're nowhere near it. Whereas ChatGPT makes it look like, I mean, let's be honest, this thing can write an article about like Rococo architecture in Chinese in 15 seconds. It almost seems like you're dealing with a very smart person or a sentient machine, whereas actually driving a car, we're realizing how far we are from a human intellect once you add all the inputs and the sensors and the environmental interactions.
Yeah, and for folks that aren't familiar with the levels of car autonomy that we're talking about, here's what the SAE says. 0 is no automation. Level 1 is regular driver assistance, like adaptive cruise control. Level 2 is systems like Blue Cruise and Cadillac Super Cruise, where you're looking at the road, the system is doing the steering, but it's not assuming that you're not paying attention. You're paying attention, you are in charge the entire time. Level 3, a lot of manufacturers believe that level 3 is probably the most difficult to achieve because it is conditional automation. So conditionally, the driver can be doing something else, but they have to be ready to take over. And this has always been the trouble with level 3 has been what situation is so bad that autonomy cannot deal with it and it must ask you to take over. But how is that situation predictable enough to tell you in enough time that you need to start paying attention and then be ready to take over? That's a tricky one. Level 4 is high levels of autonomy in geofence situations. So like we get on the highway, now you may not pay attention. And it does all the highway stuff, but no city roads or things like that. And then level 5 is full in, steering wheel free, get in robo-taxi.
It is amazing to me that I think back in 2016, if you'd ask people, are we closer to electrifying all cars or AI self-driving cars? Like which technical hurdle do you feel is easier to surmount? I thought back in 2016, 17, even 18, people would have said, look, we're going to have self-driving cars long before we have broad scale electrification. And I think now from the vantage point of 2023, that's sort of inverted. People are talking about, by 2050, certainly having retired all of the gas powered cars, no one's talking about level 5 anymore.
Not to toot my own horn, but I was never on board with the autonomous revolution happening anytime soon. I have friends to prove that. Very intense arguments over this topic. If nothing else, there's not just the technological hurdle to go over. There's the regulatory hurdle. Whose fault is it when your autonomous car hits something? Is it the manufacturer of the car that's liable? Because nobody's going to make a car autonomous if that's the case. Like, General Motors will never sell you an autonomous car if General Motors is on the hook when you run over a 5-year-old. That is not going to happen, right? But also there's some strong issues, some big issues surrounding autonomy and the difficulty of programming these things in. If you simply want to make a car that can drive sort of like a timid 15-year-old from San Francisco to Los Angeles, we can do that today. Tesla has proven that. Fair weather, good visibility, a little timid, a little crazy now and then in intersections where, maybe the car doesn't cause an accident, but it's kind of an accessory to it. Let's put it that way. That kind of thing will definitely go wrong. And then on the highway, it seems to be just fine because that kind of situation is much more predictable. The lane lines are generally good. We have lots of good mapping information on the highway. Cars act in predictable manners. But what happens when there's, a stalled car on the road? Well, sometimes Teslas run into it. What happens when there's a police car on the side of the road? What happens when it's a chair that's fallen off the back of a pickup truck? Does it hit the chair? Does it stop? Does it swerve? We don't know. What if it's not a chair and you program the car for the chair situation, but next time it's an ottoman? Does it know the difference? What if it's a mattress? All these kinds of things are a problem. What do you do when visibility is poor? That's been a constant problem, right? I mean, there was the autonomous Volvo, not Volvo's software, mind you, I can't remember what the name of that company was, that hit the woman, remember, in the rain? Or was it night?
If your car is based entirely on cameras and it has no radar and it has no other means of sensing its surroundings, it's entirely dependent on what the lens can see. And the lens can't necessarily see any more than you can.
Right.
So I would say also, if you ever tried to merge dovetail into one lane around a construction zone, AI has an incredible fit trying to resolve that and deal with it. So basically, hey, kids, TikTok teens, ChatGPT might be able to help you ace a take-home test, but do not use it for a driver's test.
Yeah, it would definitely be. I think that's a decent hurdle away from us at this point in time. The raw computing power on board of a car required also is just really expensive. It's doable logically from what we can extrapolate, but is anybody willing to pay for the kind of high-end computing and data crunching also that you'd require? I mean, in addition to the bonkers $10,000 upgrade on a Tesla.
So I think that leaves us at a bit of an impasse. So guys, don't worry, your robot overlords aren't coming anytime soon, especially if they have to drive to get you.
They'll just take a Boston Dynamics, insect robot that's way creepier anyway, with the 8 legs.
the funny thing is with the Boston Dynamics, we might wind up with autonomous horses that we can ride long before we have autonomous cars, like robo horses. Let's do it.
I might be on board with that. Let's try the robo horse, see how it goes.
Speaking of paying for capability you will not use, we have a very serious and warning for our overseas listeners. It's going to get awfully US centric, but a very serious discussion of pickup trucks in America over the last 30 years. And we have seen some dramatic changes. They were always among the best sellers, but now, as they've supplanted everything from the humble family sedan to the station wagon to the minivan and even the SUV, trucks are changing, and I'm not sure that we are changing that much in how we use them.
Indeed. And I think that is an interesting point, that we're not changing how we use them, because Americans never really did some of the things we think we did with pickup trucks back when pickup trucks were, just two-door long bed things. So that's part of the problem there. If I go ahead and, apparently I did not save the document that I thought of here, so my numbers might be off. Sorry, listeners here. But at any rate, if we take a look back in 1970, the best-selling pickup truck in America was the Chevy, before the Chevy Silverado, it was the CK series of trucks. It was specifically the C trucks, because rear-wheel drive vastly outsold four-wheel drive. Can you guess by how much?
Rear-wheel drive outsold four-wheel drive. I'm guessing it's like 90%, because four-wheel drive was like a Jeep thing only back then.
Yeah, it was almost 95%. It was bonkers. There's also been some discussion around my statement on Facebook about pickup trucks not being quite as at the level of importance, not quite as crazy of a sales volume thing back then as it was today. And some folks have pushed back on that, saying, well, GM still sold a lot of pickup trucks. And indeed they did. They sold about 380 to 400,000 half-ton trucks in 1970. When you take a look at truck sales numbers, folks out there, it's important to remember to separate light-duty and heavy-duty trucks. We're talking about light-duty trucks, F-150, Silverado 1500, and their predecessors back then. It used to be called the CK and, of course, the F-100 at the time. And a lot of those numbers at the time, when GM published those numbers, in the truck category, they also put Suburban, and they put the vans, and they put chassis cabs and things like that in there as well. So be sure and separate all those out. Any rate, so we're talking about 400,000 units. That was pretty good. But GM also shifted at one point in the 60s and 70s about 5 million cars in the U.S. Now they're down to about 2.5 million cars in the U.S., but around 700,000 half-ton trucks. So the share of General Motors offerings in the United States that was a truck went from, 10%, something like that, to a full third of the manufacturer's volume. So as far as importance, half-ton trucks are very, very important in a way that they weren't quite as important back then. So with that framing in mind, we now also have an America that is shifted from about 25% of the population living in rural America in the 1970 specifically in that census, to the last census in the United States where it's under 10% living in rural America. And yet we have more half-ton trucks sold, and it's not because more people are off-roading. It's not because more people are towing or hauling or doing farm or ranch work. It's because it's become the family car. It has 4 doors, and that's fantastic.
And that's, before we get into exactly how people are using this thing, I found it ironic that the number one criticism leveled at the F-150 Lightning was that you can't tow long distances with it. Mm-hmm. And in America, where people rarely even road trip, the idea of road tripping and doing it with 3 horses as basis for just categorically discounting a car, it seemed a strange one. So let's look at how people are actually using their trucks. In 2019, Strategic Vision polled a broad base of pickup truck owners, everyone from contractors to family men to folks who use them recreationally or even just as commuters. And the number one indexed use for full-size half-ton trucks was pleasure driving. Mm-hmm. That was in 2019. Now, recently, Axios did an interesting study where they went and they surveyed about 1,200 F-150 owners who owned 2012 to 2021 F-150s. They found that the number one use was shopping and errands. The number 2 use was pleasure driving.
Yeah.
And if you're wondering how many people used these trucks for towing frequently, it was exactly 7% of them.
Yes. So it's like there are people that want to tow regularly with their truck. And, this is not leveled at you. If you do that regularly with your truck, don't buy the Lightning. You probably weren't interested in it anyway. There is a gasoline or a diesel truck for you. This is not the vehicle that fits your lifestyle. But if you are that person that is using it for commuting, you're using it for shopping, and you're never towing anything, it's like there's an absolutely bonkers percentage. You have to correct me on the data here, but it was something like almost 90% rarely or never tow, and they did not give us a separate answer for never. It was just rarely or never. Like, who knows where we are in this thing.
Yeah, it was 93% either occasionally or rarely or never tow with their truck. Now here's the thing. My Uncle Mark, he was a carpenter, self-taught. He was for 30 years out on Long Island building houses, building decks, building porches. Later on, when he started to hurt his back and break down physically, he became a contractor. He always had Econoline vans because he said, honestly, Tim, look, I like the pickups, but am I really going to leave all my tools out in the rain at a work site? Am I going to leave things that cost me, like loan money that I can afford to buy once every 5 years? Am I going to leave them out where people can get them?
That is true.
So he always had these vans that were built on full-size truck platforms, but he needed a housed container for his stuff. And when he finally did get a pickup truck at the end, it was, at the point he'd become a contractor, he had more money, but he wasn't actually doing the job himself anymore. That was a full crew cab for his now burgeoning family. And so it became the family car, and the Econoline was always the work truck. If you look at the price of pickup trucks in America now, I mean, it's all over the map, but the benchmark half-ton pickup is selling for between $60,000 and $65,000 average transaction price. Even in this era of inflation, the average car sells between about, I want to say it's like $48,000. So there's a big delta there. Now, there are tons of contractor grade steel wheel, whitewashed, minimum option work trucks out there. To get that average transaction price up to 60 to 65,000, you've got to have an awful lot of 450 horsepower, leather-lined urban cowboy truck.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and it's obvious when you take a look at what trucks are being sold, what trim levels are going, what body styles are popular, et cetera, that it's really obvious what the average truck buyer is doing with their truck. The sales of big cab, small bed trucks are through the roof, which is why the average truck out there has gone from a time where it was 60% bed, 35% cab, something like that, to the exact opposite, where the beds are shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. Now we're down to 6.5-foot beds being by far the most common format. 5.5-foot beds being popular is probably just right around the corner, to be perfectly honest, because more room on the inside is what people seem to want. Enough that Ford and General Motors won't even sell you anything approaching mid-level or up-end trims with just the regular cab long bed format. It's basically just the bottom end of the lineup. And Ram didn't even bother designing a new cab for their truck in regular cab format. If you want a regular cab and 8-foot bed, you got to buy the old truck.
Yeah, to be perfectly honest, this is a recent trend. I mean, in 2001, Ford for the first time offered a regular production full crew cab. That is 4 full-size doors. Basically, everything you would get in an SUV except the housed-over cargo area. And whereas 30 years ago, 37% of the truck was cab and 63% was bed, now it's exactly the opposite. 37% is bed and 63% is cab. And we've even got an upcoming Ram EV that might have a sort of an embryonic sort of third row built.
Yeah, I'm going to be interested to see what that looks like. And it is funny because the concept of the full 4-door cab dates back to the 1950s. International had one, and it was hideous, absolutely positively hideous. Sorry if you're an International fan. I think that was the ugliest truck I have ever seen, including the Cybertruck, and I need to put my eyes out now. But after that, we started getting tiny little doors. We got a 3-door truck, we got a 4-door truck, baby back seat, unusable, little squished area back there, and they kept growing and growing and growing. But I did find it surprising because somehow I thought that 4-door trucks existed before 2001, but no, as we know them today, that Ford you mentioned, that was the first one that we think about from a big 3 auto manufacturer that had 4 actual real doors and real SUV-like room in the back.
Yeah, it's funny because when I was a little kid back in the late 80s, my dad had, I guess, what you describe as like the forerunner of today's Nissan Frontier, but it was a king cab, and king cab meant it had these two like jump seats that would fold down, so you'd be facing like left right across the interior of the truck. And we were blown away back then that someone had a pickup truck with a seat in the back. It was unheard of in Georgia in like 1989.
I was blown away that someone would sit in them.
Well, I was 5 years old. But still,
no need for child seats. Remember,
I mean, if you were like a cowboy back then, the ultimate like cowboy Camaro was standard cab short bed V8, and then if you were like a sporty fellow, you'd get it with a manual transmission. Try to find a standard cab short bed pickup today. Go ahead, try it. You won't find it in the United States. You might be able to get like a Silverado sold in Mexico with that. That's you will not find it in the United States today. You definitely won't find it with a manual transmission.
In a weird world, you know what? I will eat my hat if this ever happens again. But I would buy a regular cab, 5.5 or 6 foot bed half-ton truck that could tow 10,000, 15,000 pounds. That would be absolutely perfect, because trucks have become so large that you would have to shrink the bed to that size to make it easier to park and easier to maneuver. But if it still had all the truck internals and a nice boxed frame, et cetera, that could do 10,000, 15,000 pounds of towing capability, maybe an attachment for a gooseneck or fifth wheel, that would be absolutely fantastic. I would buy one of those in a heartbeat. Turning circle, under 40 feet, that would be great. Problem is, no one does that with their truck in reality. Everyone thinks that they do. There is this definite, like, one day I might go to Home Depot and decide that I'm going to build my own deck and I'm going to buy all the lumber myself. Well, I mean, maybe you'll do that one day, but guess what? You could do that in your 5.5 foot or 6.5 foot bed truck. Stuff's going to stick out a lot. Or you could have the larger lumber delivered. If you're doing 8 foot stuff, that's great. It'll hang out the back. If you're out getting 20-foot beams, that's not going to work in an 8-foot bed either. You need a lumber rack, or you need a trailer, or you should just call the flatbed dude and have it delivered.
And look, every person my uncle knew who used a pickup for work would get a standard cab, and they would get an extended bed. Because if you're really working with the truck, you're going to want to put in a bed chest. Because if you can't house over your tools, you're going to at least want to lock them up and protect them from the rain.
Yep.
So once you add a bed chest to some of these crew cab pickup beds, you've got nothing. You've got about as much storage space.
There's nothing left
as you'll have behind the seat in like a 2-door Wrangler. I mean, there's nothing left once you put a bed chest back there. It's basically just a trunk with a tailgate.
Yep.
And I'm not beating up on pickup truck owners and enthusiasts. I think there have been some pickup trucks that I thought were super cool that weren't terribly practical. I thought the original GMC Cyclone was awesome. I loved the second and first generation Ford F-150 Lightnings, especially the supercharged truck around the turn of the century. Those were all really cool, especially when they were step side. They looked really neat. But like, I have a Corvette, which is a fun car. I don't really pretend that I might someday need to autocross at an SCCA event. Therefore, I have my Corvette just in case the day comes that someone puts a gun to my head and I've got to autocross my road car. And I think we haven't quite reached that point where people are honest with themselves about why they buy pickup trucks. Because back in the 90s, we all told ourselves this lie that we needed SUVs like the Explorer and the Grand Cherokee, and in the early 90s, the Wagoneer, because someday we might have to go off-road. And then eventually we gave that up. We gave up the off-road capability, the locking low ranges, the ground clearance, the body-on-frame construction, and pretty much the SUVs turned into tall station wagons, and everyone's fine with that. I don't know how a Subaru Crosstrek is technically a truck, but the fact that we consider it that way means we got over our off-road excuses about why we were buying these things. So I'm just wondering, will people ever say, look, I think trucks are cool. I will never tow. I will never haul. I am never going to be a contractor or a landscaper, but I want that capability anyway, just because, and I'm willing to pay a $15,000 to $20,000 price premium to have it.
Well, the Crosstrek is CAFE classified as a car, so it depends on which government agency you ask.
Yeah, exactly.
But in a way, the reality is there are people that are offended by calling a truck a lifestyle vehicle because they assume that's associated with a convertible or a this or that or something else. All vehicles are lifestyle vehicles. I don't care what vehicle it is, whether you're buying a true medium duty truck or the tiniest little thing ever, they're all lifestyle vehicles. What do you want your vehicle to say about you? How does it look? How does it do whatever it is you want it to do? Is a consideration on absolutely everybody's minds. And it's not singling pickup truck owners out to say that. I mean, if you're buying an SUV, who's out there going, I want the ugliest SUV ever. I want it to look like none of my friends drive it. I want it to look like, turd on a stick. No one's saying, no one's saying that. But there is this group that is like that. That is almost in denial of it. They're like, oh no, that's not why I bought this. I bought it because I must have this. But I would say that goes for every category of vehicle. I have 2 kids. I must have the 3-row vehicle. Well, okay, you have 2 kids. Like, what's going on with the other 4 seats in the car? And it's that shopping for the occasional. It's well, the grandparents might come now and then. Maybe I'm gonna find a carpool to join, and I'll have to be able to shuttle all the kids around, that sort of thing. Maybe I'm going to buy the Wrangler because I moved to Portland and I might go off-roading one day. Those sorts of things. And the pickup truck falls into that same category. I'm going to buy the pickup truck because I want to take up rock climbing and I need somewhere to put my gear, things like that.
Yeah, it's a combination of your delusional gym membership and your automotive aspirations all rolled into one.
Yeah. I mean, if practicality and reality were a thing, a lot of Americans would be just fine with a 2-seat vehicle in the family, because if you're commuting regularly, there are cars, lots of families out there, even people with children, are never driving with the children in one of their cars in the family. So if you're a multi-car household and there's a commuter car, why is that commuter car a 4-seat car? Are you really going to get the booster seats, the child seats, forward-facing or rear-facing, whatever kind of child seat or child restraint device you have? Are you really going to get it out and trade it around the vehicles? Or are you in the category where you're just like, I'm going to buy a child seat for everything? I don't know many people, even relatively wealthy people, that are on that front. Usually the child seats go in the one, the kids need to come, they go in the kid car. The other car, So, it's that same logic.
I mean, here's the thing. If you have all the money in the world and you don't have to park the thing and you just want a lifestyle vehicle that, makes you feel rough and tough, and maybe every once in a while you're going to use it for, I don't know, some soft roading or towing, you're going to throw the Christmas tree in the back, that's all fine. But there are practical ways you sort of become a prisoner of a huge vehicle when you have it. And I guess from a car buyer's guidance standpoint, where we're coming from here, is that first, your challenge is going to be price, because unless you are buying that steel wheel, 2-wheel drive V6 or 4-cylinder turbo whitewashed landscaper's truck, if you really are spending $65,000 on a full-size truck, and a lot of people are buying those on 84-month loans right now, you're going to become a prisoner of the price of the thing. That's a lot of money to lay out for a vehicle that you can't pay off quickly. If you're taking a loan that's 5, 6, 7 years long, you definitely got to ask whether you're getting your money's worth on a full-size truck. Second, there's driving. I mean, look, they're very fun to drive, and today they even drive reasonably like cars, but go ahead and try to maneuver a truck in anything like traffic. Go ahead and try to park it. I mean, go ahead and try to maneuver it in city traffic and get around in a vehicle that has 4 full-size doors and a truck bed and weighs, 6,000 to 7,000 pounds. It's an absolute chore. And then you get in a car, you get in something like a RAV4 or a crossover, you're like, I feel like I've got 4-wheel steering, even if I don't. The difference between a full-size truck and any normal vehicle is huge. And then, you are locked into a 6, 7-year loan on your truck, and gas prices go crazy because Putin does something even stupider, or geopolitical issues in the Middle East, or a refinery blows up down in Louisiana. All of a sudden, gas is $5 again, and you've got to put 30 gallons of it in because you've got a real super commute. You've got one of those American-style commutes where you spend an hour or more in your car each day, and you've got to feed the beast. And now you're nowhere near being able to get out of that thing, and you've got to fuel it up. So, I'm not obviously anyone playing cowboy. I play race car driver in my Corvette. I'm not Johnny O'Connell. I'm not Ron Fellows. I never will be. But there are costs to owning a truck like this.
Yeah.
You got to be ready for the costs that exist now and the ones that might spring up on you if you have to move to a crowded area, if gas prices go up, if you lose your job or you have to take a job with a lower income and you have to pay those bills. There are a lot of disadvantages to buying what would be, statistically your average half-ton truck today.
Yep. My advice is a little bit more simple. Buy what you like, and that will make you happier. But if you are questioning what should I do, the reality is the vast majority of car shoppers are not asking for this level of advice. They've already decided what they want, and they want affirmation that they're making the right decision. That's lovely. Buy what you want. Buy what will make you happy. But if you are questioning, really think about some of the things we've talked about.
Yeah. Buy used. Pre-owned is great. Buy mid-sized. Less size is better. And if you can, and this is my advice to anyone buying a car, for the car you have to drive every day, pay as much of it as you can on the down payment in cash, or just buy the thing outright if you can write the check. Avoid loans if you can.
Yep. But remember, if you don't buy it new, no one else will have it used, because it's got to be new to be used.
That's true. That's true.
And that is currently a problem we have right now. Used car inventory is very tight in the U.S. Because there aren't as many new cars being purchased over the last few years, and fewer cars are being leased. A lot more people seem to have moved to purchases over the last 3-year stint or so. So that is actually becoming a relatively big problem soon in the U.S. If we don't see an uptick in new car production, if we don't see an uptick in leasing, the used car market is going to get yet more constrained and more of a tricky place to be.
Okay, so I think we should talk about the electric car that was killed off by factors perhaps beyond the control of any one person. Everyone loves the celebrated case of the EV1, which I suppose is like your greeny alternative to a 1990s, since we're pickup theme today, like a 1990s Ranger EV. So let's say you wanted a purpose-built EV back in the 1990s, and you didn't want a lead-acid battery-powered midsize Ford truck. Well, the EV1 appeared to point the way to the future. It was based on the GM Impact concepts, and it was, for its time, a frame-up, no-compromise, dedicated EV in an era when no one was doing that. Yep. It did not last. There were two generations.
Of course, designed for a lead-acid battery, too, though.
There were 2 generations. There were about 660 of the Gen 1s with the lead-acid, and then there were nickel metal hydride, like 450, 460 of them, which were more capable. But this was a vehicle that was probably doomed from the start, Alex, and I think reason one is it was a freaking 2-door, 2-seat coupe.
Yeah, I mean, I've always found it fascinating that there is this cabal, shall we say, that is convinced there was some drastic plot out there to kill the EV1. The EV1 was a compliance car. The government said it must exist. General Motors begrudgingly made it exist, and in order to meet the demands of the era for range and reality and just the level of technology that we had at the time, it came as a very, very small car. It was 169 inches long. It was teeny tiny. Most of that was bumper. It looked like a toy car. It only seated 2 people, etc. So when we look realistically at the EV1's prospects, nobody had to kill it. There was no conspiracy. It was stillborn. It was never going to get off the ground anyway. It was $33,995. You could have bought a mid-level Mercedes-Benz C-Class for that pricing to get 2 seats and a very optimistic 79 miles of range. It took 9 seconds to go 0 to 60. It was just 137 horsepower. You had nowhere to charge it. And General Motors, more importantly, lost in 1997 dollars approximately $100,000 for every EV1 they built.
And that is quite a thing to note. $100,000 in 90s money was an enormous amount. Back then, a Porsche 911 was $70,000 to $80,000. A Corvette started, I believe, I would say the C5 initially was like, I think it was like $38,000, $39,000, the C5 Corvette. You could get a loaded up cowboy Cadillac F-150 with leather and everything for that kind of money. The EV1 is an interesting car because in an era of compliance cars, it was the one that represented a real moonshot effort to build a dedicated EV. Now, to be totally fair, the later nickel metal hydride really did have more range, more capability. They were quicker, they could go 100 miles, but they were still very limited in what they could do. And if you think public charging infrastructure is lackluster today, imagine being at the mercy of 110-volt plugs everywhere you went back in the 90s.
The problem with the EV1 nickel metal hydride was that it was even more expensive. So the loss was even larger than $100,000. It was still just as slow as the lead acid one. It was rated for 105 miles, but that was dreadfully optimistic still. So real world range was definitely below 100 miles. And you could no longer charge the nickel metal hydride EV1 on the level 1 of the day charge cords. So they were paddles. It was an inductive paddle that you actually had to stick in the car. It's kind of the size of a book. You'd like grab your book and you'd push it in the slot like a VCR tape.
Right.
And because of some of the realities around the nickel metal batteries, charging profiles, and all nickel metal hydride battery chemistry, just generally speaking, it was not a great solution. Not only could you not charge at 120 volts, so you drove to your friend's house that was maybe 50 miles away, you probably couldn't get back home, and you could not plug in at your friend's house to gain any charge because you could not charge at 120 volts. You could plug the old ones in. The lead acid one had a temporary portable charge cord, but the cooling system in the nickel metal hydride model and the just general inefficiencies of nickel battery chemistry charging meant that you gained almost no range while plugging it in. So you just burnt 1,500 watts for nothing. Was the problem there. Nickel metal hydride batteries, there was also this huge conspiracy that, General Motors sold the technology to Exxon, Chevron, whoever it was, and that was who put the death knell on nickel metal battery technology. It was never a good fit for an electric vehicle. They can't fast charge like you can fast charge a lithium-ion battery, but yet you can't slow charge them like you can slow charge a lithium-ion battery either. So charging a nickel battery slowly is actually bad for battery life. Nickel batteries have memory issues, so if you don't completely charge and discharge the battery on a regular basis, they can suffer from a memory issue, and then you can't actually use the whole battery anymore. Biggest problem is if you think your Tesla's power hungry when it's parked, nickel metal hydride batteries have a hugely rapid self-discharge rate. They will generally discharge, depending on the chemistry, 5 to 20% in just the first few days, and then between 0.5% and 4% per day for every day after that. It wasn't until 2005 that there was a new battery chemistry developed for nickel metal hydride batteries that would cut that down to 70% discharge after a year. So imagine, in a Tesla, you turn off your Sentry mode, etc. You put it into sleep mode. You come back after a month and you're like, oh, I only have half a battery left. That's actually a good thing, because if you did that in a nickel metal hydride EV1, you'd come back and it would be dead. On the bright side, they don't tend to brick as easily as lithium batteries, and they do suffer less from temperature fluctuations. So hot weather, cold weather, it generally is easier on the battery. But all of these things together just meant that nickel metal chemistry was never going to work right in an EV.
That's very important to note, because I think some people get a little bit, they look at where nickel metal hydride has worked, and has worked well in certain hybrid applications, but it's not the kind of thing that scales, because it works in a 1.5 kilowatt format doesn't mean you can multiply that by 30 and get the same result.
Exactly. And think about how that hybrid system uses the battery. When it self-discharges, does it matter? No, because it's a hybrid. It's not an EV. Does the memory effect have an issue? No, because the EV system can deliberately cycle the battery when it needs to keep that memory effect at bay. But this is also why Toyota has dedicated to the nickel metal hydride battery in their hybrids for quite some time, because of some of the definite advantages that it does have in a hybrid specifically, in the wide temperature range ability of the battery. It's greater ability to, or tendency, lower tendency to catch fire. That's definitely a good thing. Lower energy density means less likely to burst into flames. Lower energy density also means lower cooling requirements. So that's why they can be air-cooled rather than be liquid-cooled.
Also important to note is that there were some practical and intangible reasons that the EV1 didn't succeed. Aside from being exactly the wrong type of car for the market, let's face it, the American personal car, the two-door, like luxury car. The two-door personal statement was going out in the 90s. We saw the end of the Mercury Cougar, the Ford Thunderbird, the Lincoln Mark 8, the Eldorado. And to the kind of person who had EV1 money and the kind of interest in an EV1 that you typically saw at the time, in general, we were looking at people who had upscale lifestyles. They had room for a third or a fourth car. They were the kind of person who in a different era would have bought like an Eldorado or a Lincoln Mark. So that market was ebbing. The two-door car just for one dude was disappearing. And there were other problems, like the EV1 looked like a Saturn, even though it was technically the only General Motors branded product.
Yep.
And that, Saturn was kind of like the butt of jokes by the late 90s. It might have been a revolutionary retail model by American car standards in the early 90s. By the late 90s, it was the kind of thing that like the Ellen Show would joke about, or Seinfeld would joke about.
Yeah.
And it didn't help that, and this is a practical constraint rather than an intangible one. The car's market was very limited. It was available in the West, the Southwest, and briefly in Atlanta. So even if you were that person who was willing to get on board with a weird lease, a limited vehicle, and basically a pilot production program, you probably couldn't get one. And there were a lot of people in New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey who had signed up, but they couldn't get the car.
Exactly. There was a big problem. And I think that led to the conspiracies. And then the fact that they were all leased furthered the conspiracies. So you could not buy an EV1 like you could buy a first generation RAV4 EV. And this is often the parallel that's cited in some of these conspiracy theories. You could buy the RAV4 EV. It used nickel metal hydride batteries, but it launched in 97, so it launched after the EV1, and after the EV1 had moved to nickel batteries as well. So GM spent a lot of money developing kind of a second-generation EV1, one on lead-acid batteries, another with the drivetrain re-optimized for nickel batteries. That was pretty expensive there to start with. Supplies of nickel metal batteries were very, very limited. It was very much like the lithium-ion start back when the first production EVs in the current generation started. They'd only been used in laptops for, I believe, it was like 4 years prior to that. So we're in a world where consumer electronics had yet to get on board with these things. You were still buying portable phones at home that used NiCad batteries. That was what was going on in all of our consumer electronics home, was NiCad batteries, not nickel metal hydride. So it was that world that these things were starting in. And then in order to cut their losses, GM said, you know what, we're just not gonna renew the lease. All the leases are gonna end. We're gonna crush them all. We don't want to deal with this. We want to forget about all the money that we spent. Throw no more money on the fire. It'll be over. And Toyota let you keep them, which I think might have been the only misstep GM really made in this program. They did it because they had to. So they followed along. They did the thing they needed to do. But then they could have left them out there. They were worried about warranty issues, which is logical. If you have the warranty time period that was required, if they had sold those again or let people keep the lease, there still would have been a warranty period that they would have to support and service the vehicle for, and that would have meant cost on their side. Cost for all these unique components, crash components, service components, etc. There's lots of cost wrapped up into that. A lot of folks don't think about the cost of supporting a new vehicle on the marketplace. It's not just the building the car. It's the fact that you have to have a certain number of warranty components for warranty replacements or crash replacements, etc., warehoused all over the U.S. And there's inventory control and management and all that. It's a major pain in the bottom for car companies to deal with when we're talking about low volume trims and low volume models. But I think it actually would have served them better if they'd done that.
I think they were looking at parts support and service support. There were so few service centers that were even trained to work on the car. What does a fire department, need to do to safely cut a person out of this car? How do you disseminate that information and create training programs for rescue authorities? You look at Tesla, which makes 1 million cars a year. And look at how much trouble they have providing subframes, suspension components, and body panels for cars that get involved in crashes. It can take weeks, sometimes even months. Tesla is a pretty committed EV startup. I don't feel like this is a tangential business for them, and it's still a challenge. So to take roughly 1,100, 1,200 cars and have a national scale sales and service and maintenance setup with the tools, diagnostic equipment, which was all unique, parts that were built barely above the prototype level of fabrication. It was almost like series production prototype, where every piece is bespoke and the very tooling to make the parts is itself prototype.
Yep.
It would have been very expensive, whereas a lot of those other cars like the Ranger EV or the Toyota RAV4 EV, they were based on vehicles that were already widely sold. So at the very least, if you need a body panel, you can get it. Whereas with the EV1, GM probably did too good a job of building a purpose-built EV.
Yep.
It didn't share any body panels, those famous plastic Saturn body panels. You didn't get them on the EV1, or you didn't get them in any sense that was interchangeable. So crushing them was a bad look. What they should have done is they should have donated them all to university engineering departments, museums, display only for dealers that wanted to keep one for historic reasons. That would have been the way to deal with them. Just try to give as many as you can to charities, to just organizations that can display it, learn from it, or curate its history. Crushing the car was rather extreme. And since these weren't on like an import visa, the way the old Chrysler turbine cars were, there was no need to crush them, because you remember the turbine car was Chrysler. The turbine car was the EV1 of the 60s.
I mean, it's just it's a matter of where else, what else are you going to do with it? I mean, you have 500 cars you're pulling back. There aren't that many museums, et cetera. So, I mean, the crushing is just a thing. That's just how they happen. Like almost all the cars that I drive end up in a crusher at some point. A lot of people don't realize that. The pre-production vehicles that we drive, they can never be sold because they may or may not meet all the FMVSS standards that they're required to meet. So the vast majority of them, especially if I'm driving around, if you see in a video and I'm driving around in a car with the manufacturer plate on it, that car is probably headed to the crusher when this model year is over. So the regular crushing of cars is just a thing that car companies are very used to in a way. So it just wouldn't have been a weird thing for them to do. The point about it being based on a unique platform is very relevant because RAV4, they just basically grabbed a RAV4, tweaked a few things, jammed some batteries on there, but all the body panels, et cetera, could still be just pulled off of another RAV4 in an accident, et cetera. And Toyota did sell more of them, so that might have helped some of the logic around that. They sold about 1,500 RAV4s in the few years after the EV7 went wrong. So I think it was 97 to 2003, something like that. And then there were leases and purchases available in the RAV4, but its range wasn't really any better.
I'll also say this. It's worth exploring where the EV1 came from, because there was a class of vehicle called the compliance car that's almost entirely dead today. I think, what is it, like the Mazda MX-30 or something? Like Mazda has an EV with 100-mile range. That is a compliance car, and possibly the last of the entire compliance car genre. But back in 1990, the California Air Resources Board, which had existed for decades dating back to the 60s, created something called a zero emissions vehicle program.
Mm-hmm.
And this was an aspirational project to introduce vehicles that did not intrinsically emit anything. Power plants emit, power sources emit, but the vehicles themselves were not supposed to emit. And this gave birth to the ZEV1 and LEV1 standards, whereby initially the top 7 automakers by volume in California would have to sell a certain number of cars that had absolutely no intrinsic emissions.
Yep.
Now, the first thing I want to say about this is that it was completely impossible using the technology of 1990. California knew that. The automakers knew that. There were no illusions about this actually happening in the short term. It was aspirational. Another thing people need to know about these zero emissions vehicle programs is that they have continuously been pushed back as technology and practicality have intervened in aspirational idealism. So these have never been hard and fast rules. Also, the initial efforts were almost all tepid compliance cars. They gave birth to a genre of vehicle that existed to comply with the LEV1 and the LEV2 so that these large automakers could continue to tap California's massive market for conventional cars. So I
would argue that at their heart, every zero emissions vehicle we see in the United States is still truly a compliance car, because Toyota would not be financially a viable company for the last up until the last maybe about 2 years or so. Anything prior to that was really dependent on ZEV credit and CAFE credit sales. So that's largely where a lot of profit came from. And even now, if you were to remove the CAFE and ZEV compliance credits from Tesla's bottom line, they would most likely be losing money. We don't have all the details there on their financials because some of it's just shrouded in the way things are reported, but that is a big business. So, the logical reason that Ford is making lots of EV trucks, et cetera, also is to balance that ZEV credit thing out because they're not making money in their own right. And I think that is the big thing when people talk about Tesla's profitability is, yes, Tesla has a good margin. What would that margin be if they weren't including the sales of those ZEV credits to other companies so that they can continue to make gasoline vehicles? It might be zero, and it would certainly be less than a mainline auto company in the U.S. That's kind of a weird twist there when you think about the way that some of those financials work. It's, Tesla's got 28% margin. Okay, but is that 28% go to zero or does it go negative when you deduct those credits? And then how would we compare that to, say, a Mach-E, which is theoretically breaking even at the moment, maybe? There's some rumor that it might actually be losing money now. It was profitable at the beginning. Resources have gone up. Mach-E might be break even or losing money, but they're not selling those ZEV credits. And if they were, then they could call it a profitable car like Tesla's calling their cars profitable.
I'm going to make a distinction between compliance cars and ZEV credits just because the compliance cars were a no-go, or a go-no-go. There we go. So here's the thing. If you didn't have the cars on the market, you could not sell cars. So it was a serious impediment to doing any business in California. Now, subsequently, the whole idea of tradable emissions credits did contribute to Tesla's survival, particularly when they were trying to ramp up the Model 3 in 2016, 17, and 18. They stayed in business because of those tradable credits. There's no question about that. But Tesla is not itself building compliance cars because it's not building its cars so that it can in turn sell the gas cars that actually make the money.
There's just the question of isn't intrinsically every ZEV car a compliance car? Now there's the we threw minimal effort at the EV and it's only 5 miles range. That's very easily classified as a compliance car. But when we take a look at Tesla's financials, they sold $2.1 billion of credits in 2021.
But what was their gross revenue?
Let's see here.
It's going to be
the question is, what was Tesla's profit in 21?
I mean, here's the thing. Tesla hasn't required those credits to survive for a while. They've been consistently profitable. I would say at this point, no Tesla is a compliance car because ultimately they're selling EVs so that they can sell EVs. And now for other companies, I think right now the reason they're selling EVs is not so much in order to perpetuate gas sales forever. I think it's first trying to learn these technologies so that once EVs become the standard in the industry, they'll be able to sell them profitably in all cases. Like, I think they realize at this point that if you're selling nothing but gas-powered cars by 2030, you're probably not viable as an automaker. And, all of the reasons that people bought EV1s and Honda EV Pluses and, the Ford Ranger Electric in the 90s, it's not the reason people are buying Mach-E's and Teslas, Lucids.
That's right. It's not the same reason now. But remember, the ZEV credit mandate at the time was not you have to offer it for sale. It has to be a percentage of your sales or you have not complied. So you can't just offer it.
They were really,
but
like 200 a year.
Well, EV1, I mean, right, it was 2%, but still imagine getting someone to buy 2% of the EV1. I mean, that just would never have happened at that price point, et cetera. Nobody's ever been able to shift that many of those, which is why the credit trading scheme was invented, which is why we have general compliance now. And the answer for 2021 was that a full approximate half of Tesla's profit in 2021 was simply ZEV credits.
That makes sense, but we're not at survival levels.
But that's why I'm saying. Like the last 2 to 3 years been fine, but prior to that, the entire history prior to 2020, Tesla depended on those ZEV credit sales for survival. They would not have been in business if it wasn't for the ZEV credits.
I agree with you on that. I would say particularly again like 16, 17, 18, when they were hemorrhaging money trying to set up the Model 3 production. But I would also say that of those ZEV credits, were like 99% sold to Fiat Chrysler.
It's hard to tell because companies. Let's see who they sold them to. Mercedes and BMW, Porsche, etc. are big buyers of ZEV credits. Um, and like Honda sells ZEV credits, for instance.
I would also say the other reason EVs today aren't compliance cars is because they're often available in at least the lower 48. They're available everywhere, including places
Mm-hmm.
where there are no compliance requirements. And if you're selling EVs in Texas or Alabama or Mississippi, and they are now, rest assured those are not engineered to meet any requirement. They can sell all the
Ah.
pickups they want without selling a single EV.
But they're a compliance car of a different nature because they still have to meet CAFE regulations. And that is largely why, for instance, Ford sells their EVs and plug-in hybrids in every state because Ford wants the CAFE credits. So it is still a compliance mechanism in a way, depending on how you want to look at it, which is why every other car company that sells them in all 50 states is doing that as well, or it's like the ZEV plus whatever states. That's where customer interest is, so they can sort of narrow the market a little bit to just the ZEV states plus a few extras, so that way they don't have to have all the dealers certified. But they are interested in bringing them everywhere because for every zero emissions vehicle they sell, they get a massive CAFE boost, so they don't have to pay CAFE fines. And that is the twist here, is that California operates in this credit scheme, and there is some penalty for not having the ZEV credits, but the bigger penalty generally is CAFE compliance nationally in the US, which is why we have so many plug-in hybrids around and why everybody's interested in some form of electrification or fuel economy bump in a pickup truck, because that category needs the extra credit.
Yeah, but I don't think the CAFE penalty is a big deal at all. I mean, what is it per car? It's nothing. It's
It's
like,
about 100. It's now about $150 per vehicle per mile per gallon that the target is missed.
yeah, given the way CAFE regulations are actually written, the fuel economy that you and I see on the road is not the fuel economy for CAFE purposes.
Mm-hmm.
So honestly, with the margins built into a full-size truck, I don't think they're getting clobbered there. And most SUVs today are just 2-inch lifted compact five-door hatchbacks. So I'm not totally sure that EVs are necessary to keep these automakers in business because of CAFE penalties. I don't think it's as big a deal as it looks at face value. I will also say this too. The automakers have to build an industrial base to make these EVs. That's why you're seeing
Mm-hmm.
so many new plants in Kentucky and Tennessee and Georgia. They're building entirely new battery factories, assembly plants, engineering facilities. And you've got to ramp all that stuff up long before EVs become broadly profitable. Because if you
Yeah.
have to start cold turkey with no access to minerals, no battery factories, no manufacturing partners, no engineering facilities that are steeped in EV engineering, uh, you're going to just be dead. Like that's why people are
Mm-hmm.
making such a big deal about Toyota being late to the game. It's not that Toyota lacks the industrial scope or the ability. The question is it meaningful that they're 5 to 6 years behind other companies? No one wants to be caught out and turn into the Sears of the auto world. And I think
It's yeah, volume wise, it's not really meaningful, I would say. Because ZEVs account for true ZEVs account for such a small percentage of national sales until we hit 50% of new cars being zero emissions, then you could say, oh, maybe this manufacturer is caught out in the cold. I don't think anybody is in that position right now. The question of cost of compliance, manufacturers paid, generally speaking, in 2021 far more for for CAFE compliance than they did for ZEV compliance. So that is the more expensive bucket, which explains the volume, honestly, again, as I said, behind Lightning, also why we're getting EV pickup trucks from GM in such short order rather than other formats of vehicles that they could electrify. There is a CAFE trading scheme where you can trade credits from this category to that category of CAFE, but it's not as advantageous to sell 5 bolts and then translate that into one one CAFE credit required for your pickup truck line. It makes more sense to sell some Hummers, etc.
So here is the actual formula for anyone who's wondering about CAFE penalties, and I believe this is current as of late 2021. It is something like $5.50 for each tenth of a mile per gallon that a manufacturer's CAFE performance falls short of its compliance obligation. So its penalty rate in dollars per 1/10 of a mile per gallon per vehicle times the amount of the shortfall in tenths of a mile per gallon times the number of vehicles in the manufacturer's fleet. So we can work that out separately in another venue, but that's exactly what it is for folks who are wondering.
But I'm not sure if you're looking at the most recent one. The fine went up quite a bit this last year.
Did it go up to 14?
It went up quite. It's about $150 per mile per gallon.
Okay, so the formula hasn't changed, but the penalty definitely has.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's at any rate, so we'll won't bore our listeners here with that one. But essentially the penalty is approximately $150 per mile per gallon missed. But the biggest payers of it are the luxury car makers, because nothing they make complies. So Porsche, BMW, Mercedes, they're paying CAFE fines on everything they make, and that's just fine because the cost of the vehicles is high, so it doesn't really have a meaningful impact on the going nature of the business.
So here's the thing. We were going to talk about dead-end technologies, and that's going to be a great topic for a future discussion. I think we're just about at the end of the line here. So, Alex, I'll give you the last word definitively. Are compliance cars extinct, or are cars currently on the market still compliance cars in the 90s sense?
I will say not in the 90s sense, but I would consider them compliance cars of some sort, and I'm pretty sure we're going to see some more coming soon.
Okay. And we will find out soon, hopefully from Toyota, because you guys, I hate to say it, but you're lagging a little bit. Prove the naysayers wrong, Toyota. Do something incredible. Okay, that is what we've got this week, guys. So if you're hoping that the successor to the LFA will be a quad motor, 200 mile per hour missile, you might be disappointed, but who knows? Maybe we'll get a Highlander that's actually got some guts this time, or a Grand Highlander for that matter. I'm Tim. He's Alex. Thanks for logging on. Alex, where can you find us online?
All the usual places: YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Facebooks, etc. Just hunt for Alex Autos and Auto Buyer's Guide. See all of you later.